Hello and welcome to Heart Yoga Radio. Horrible day outside again today, so we're recording in our yoga room. So this is the next part of our series where we are exploring the question, is the UK going to experience an economic collapse? So just to recap, we are doing it in 3 parts. So we're doing the past, present and future. So in the beginning, we talked about, in the first episode, various economic collapses that have happened in Britain and other countries and the kind of events that triggered them. So it's always useful to have a look at what's gone before. Then in this section, we're talking about the present, so things which are going on now. And we seem to find more and more to say in this section. So we're now on part 3 of part 2. Yeah. So in the first part of part 2, we were talking about the economy, and in part 2 of part 2, we talked about the ecosphere, and then in this episode, we want to talk about culture. So let's begin by asking the question, what do we mean when we use the word culture? So let's define the term first before we start playing with it.
Always a good move. There are many ideas of what culture is and how properly the word might be applied. Interestingly, the term culture is itself a contested concept. And as you know, we always look for the contests, the struggles, the contradictions, the antagonisms as a way in. That's a part of our dialectical method is to explore states of affairs in the world, or collections of states of affairs in the world, to try and arrive at some kind of understanding by finding your way in through the door of contradiction and the door of struggle and the door of antagonism. So culture itself has been argued over for a very long time. For instance, in the 19th century there was a fairly popular idea that there was high culture and low culture. And this is an idea that had quite a lot of traction and it informed education and so forth, and the general public understanding of the way the world worked. And low culture was the working class singing bawdy songs in pubs, and high culture was the opera and so on. And it was the area of life, psychic life you might say, rather than economic life, that was informed by the taste of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, the upcoming bourgeoisie. High culture, low culture, and obviously it's a kind of a definition that's got a whole power dynamic built into it. It imposes some kind of power relation onto society, or attempts to. I'm not going to go down that road, obviously. I'm going to take it that culture is one of the 3 interlocking systems that we've identified as being very pragmatically useful for our understanding. The other 2 being the economy and the ecosphere. And I'm going to cast the net rather wider than those Victorian critics did. I'm not going to talk about highbrow and lowbrow. I'm going to talk about all of the practices, customs, shared beliefs, including religion, politics, ethics, language, the way ideas are disseminated through news outlets, media, the internet, the arts, the popular arts, as well as the so-called high arts. Don't make too much of a distinction between high and low culture. Films, TV, soaps, political debates, the practices in the legislatures and so forth. And the generalised understanding of the world that a society tends to share in order to basically operate as a society, because society involves people interacting with each other, and that involves everybody being able to understand the language, or the language is. In quite a lot of modern societies they're polylingual. Having a basic grasp of some structure of practices, mores, manners, politeness, and so forth. So there's this huge area of all of our lives, our collective lives, that's not immediately to do with the economy, to do with production, to do with exchange, to do with speculation on the stock market and all the rest of it. It's that kind of superstructure, you might say. Now it does owe a lot to what's going on in the material world. The shape of any culture in any society owes a lot to how the means of sustaining life, the products that people consume, the food, the toys, the artefacts, the dwellings, the transport, and so on. How all that is produced has a big relationship with culture. And crude Marxists say that it's determinative of culture, that the material base determines the superstructure in a very sort of one-to-one basis. But Engels, for one, said this is quite a crude understanding, and he says, quite this, neither Marx nor I insisted on the absolute determinism from base to superstructure, except in the very, very final analysis. In other words, he recognised how much could then just be created on top of an economic base, of a particular mode of production. But nevertheless, that there is a dependency. And in fact, I would say that there is an interaction. I don't want to be an idealist and say that ideas are everything. Everything comes from ideas. But culture does feed in to the world that we live in, but it also is produced by the world that we live in, both in terms of its ecology and in terms of its economy. So these things are entangled. This is the important thing here. They're entangled in very definite ways, and you can trace threads of that entanglement, even though it's incredibly complex. So that's what I mean by culture. Now, I want to say that not only is culture concerned with day-to-day living, it's the kind of meat and potatoes of our day-to-day living. We're doing culture now because we're talking. We're exchanging ideas. We're trying to express ourselves. We're trying to figure out some kind of political position or ethical position or religious position, whatever you like. We're talking. So we're doing culture, and you see it's the meat and potatoes of everyday life. And we're reading books to help us inform ourselves. We're watching YouTube videos to help us inform ourselves. We're talking to other people to help us inform ourselves. We're going to conferences to help us inform ourselves. We're thinking hard about stuff and discussing on a daily basis in order to try and inform ourselves. Not only is it the meat and potatoes, it also has a role to form itself, to continue itself. There's something about culture which is to do with the continuity down generations. We learn stuff. We pass it on to future generations, so they don't have to invent it from scratch. And so much of our mode of life now, particularly the inventions and the technology, is the result of hundreds and hundreds of years of experiment, research, testing, trying to disprove ideas, trying to improve inventions and so forth. Hundreds of years. Where we're at now is built on what's gone before. And so culture has this role of continuity, of producing the continuity over generations. That is its beauty. And that is the beauty of traditions, you might say. Actually, that is also the drawback of traditions and continuous cultures, because that is the means by which really stupid superstitions are continued down generations. I don't know, like genital female mutilation or voting Tory, this kind of stuff can go in families, or being just a regular abusive arsehole. That can be like a family culture, But whole nations can do this nonsense. They can pass down superstitions which are kind of harmful, certainly not useful, as well as preserving the tricks for survival, and as well as enabling knowledge to be passed down which can be built upon. And our industrial civilization depends on that. So there's that kind of sense of culture reproducing itself, and that in our kind of society is the role of the child rearing patterns. what happens in families, etc., or kibbutzes or orphanages or whatever. Child rearing patterns. Different cultures have different child rearing patterns. Anthropology tells us this. And that's an important aspect of culture that's materially very important, because you're training the next generation of workers, the next generation of farmers, the next generation of aristocrats through the child rearing pattern. And the other, of course, is education. Now, if you study education in a country like ours, it's often described as a political football. Because different people have got different ideas, because they realise that those children are going to become adults and citizens who vote, who do occupied jobs in companies and in corporations and in parliaments and in city councils, and also occupy jobs, bullshit jobs, good jobs, who become the policemen, the policewomen, the teachers and so forth. So our vision of the future, our utopias, if you like, our ideas about what kind of culture we want it to live in, what kind of society we want to live in. Do we want it to be fair? Do we want it to be extremely egalitarian or meritocratic, or do we think that inequality is just totally fine? Do we want a high degree of liberty, personal liberty, what you might call civil rights, or none whatsoever? What do we want? What do we think's best? We envisage this. Human beings kind of, we're kind of time processing machines. If I can just put it a little bit crudely, we try and picture the future and try and determine the future. We try and make certain futures happen, but different people have different ideas. And obviously education, the way education transpires, is informed by the notion of what kind of society you want those young people to grow up into and become the citizens of, and what kind of ideas they will entertain, which then become formative of the society as they become legislators or citizens in protest groups or voters or whatever. So education, that's why it's a political football. And the fact that it is a political football tells us something very important about culture, that it is a contested area. Not only is there a contest over what culture might be, what the word might mean, there's a culture itself, I want to say, is, well, at the moment it's a battlefield, but it's always contested. It's always contested, and this kind of leaps out in certain areas of life, leaps out in politics. For instance, Mrs. Thatcher trying to crush trade unionism, and Ronald Reagan trying to crush trade unionism, was an attempt to unpick the culture of trade unionism partly. Obviously the material power of the trade unions, its ability to go on strike, its ability to hold the country to ransom. Remember, they brought down Ted Heath, the unions, pretty well. It's also an attack on its culture, and this is why dissolving the mining villages was so important to Mrs. Thatcher, because they had their own local culture, which a part of which was a very, very powerful solidarity between the workers and between the families, and a sense of local identity, and also a whole lot of other cultural production, the famous brass bands and all the rest of it. But trade union culture, working class culture, was something that had to be smashed, because it was becoming a locus of power. It was becoming a point which could exert influence on the way society would develop. And that's very illustrative of the way this area of culture, this country of culture, is a battlefield, an area of contestation. And I think that's very important to get your head round that, to understand that there are power dynamics playing out in all this. There's another thing I want to say, and that is that a society like ours isn't uniform. It doesn't just have one culture that everybody adheres to without question. It has many subcultures within it. I just mentioned the subculture of say a mining village, and you've got working class culture, you have aristocratic culture. But you also have local culture. You've got Welsh culture, Yorkshire culture. You've got gay culture. You've got youth culture. Even political parties have their own internal cultures, small cultures. They're subcultures that sit within the whole. There's a definite Tory party culture. There's a definite Labour Party culture. There are gangs. There are youth groupings. And then also there's workplace culture as well. You know, canteen culture, they used to call it in the police. They said the police had this really malignant canteen culture. And that's coming to light again as they are being pulled up over some of the crasser canteen culture. And they just call it canteen culture. And it's something that rises spontaneously out of a work environment amongst a group of people who are thrown together for 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day. And they develop their own little subculture. So you need to remember that it's kind of fragmented in a society like ours. We even societies like ours are described as multicultural. You know, when we lived in Wolverhampton, there were 150 spoken languages in the schools. You know, and somebody counted the languages. It's absolutely a microcosm of the world. You know, and there's one little place, I call it Temple Corner, a corner of the town where there was a Buddhist vihara, a couple of Sikh temples, different sort of denominations of Sikhs, a mosque, and a Serbian Orthodox church, and just down the road a Welsh chapel, you know, and so on. It's called it Temple Corner because there are all these places of worship, and all these people have got their own pretty distinct subcultures within the house culture, and this is often described as a multicultural society. Now you need to bear that in mind as well.
And this, of course, is really great for capitalism, isn't it? Because there's so many different groups they can sell all sorts of products to. So in the past, where having a bit of a monoculture was quite strongly enforced through usually religion, now they're quite happy for us to divert into all sorts of little subcultures so that they can make loads and loads of money off it, selling us like the t-shirts for this, that, and the other, and the various other bits and pieces that the various little subcultures would enjoy owning.
It's also a situation in which it's very easy to produce divide and rule tactics, so that
so that's good for the powers that be as well.
You know, it does actually feed right into their interest, the fact that they can easily set us against each other, or they get their outriders do it for them.
Yeah,
and
this could work against them as well.
It can bounce.
They'd have to. I think today, because there's so much, the subcultures are so many. I think they'd have to be awfully skilled to be able to direct it exactly the way they want.
It's a very dangerous game.
Playing with fire is
playing with fire, which is why they leave it to the outriders, you know, to Tommy Robinson and Nigel Farage to do it. But they don't suppress it too hard, except when they need to. Then they allow a bit. So it's a dangerous game. But there was a discovery made, when you rightly alluded to this, that you could allow society to diversify in this way.
As long as we were all united in capitalism.
Well, yeah. I mean, prior to that, even in my lifetime, because society was a lot more conformist than it is now. Now, in the Victorian times, and prior to that, you could be fined for not going to church. Because society, and you know, the powers that be thought, we've got to get everybody thinking the same. Obviously, their own aristocratic culture or their own oligarchical culture was separate, and that was allowed, but it was kind of kept private, you know. We knew a little bit about it, grouse shooting and all the rest of the bollocks, you know. But basically everybody else had got to all believe the same stuff, and they thought society would disintegrate without that. Yeah, so to the extent that you'd find somebody if they didn't go to mass, you know. And of course this enabled conscription in the First World War and conscription in the Second World War, whereby you could just say to all the young men over 18, unless they got flat feet, you've got to go to France and get your bollocks shot off. And they went, and people that didn't go were put in jail, or shot and vilified and ostracised by the rest of society. That sense of conformity was so strong that people went along with it. Now, people moan today about saying that the government says you've got to wear a mask. You know, 70 or 80 years ago, they might have been saying to you, you've got to go and get your bollocks shot off in France or in North Africa, and you may not return. There's quite a high likelihood that you'll come back in a coffin. And everybody went along with it. Much more conformist society than we got now. In the 1960s, what the 60s was about, apart from about 4 seconds of a genuine emancipatory kind of realisation by some small segment of youth, which lasted, I would say, okay, I'm being a bit mean-spirited, lasted a week before the capitalists discovered they could steal it and sell it back to us. Expropriation, sell it back to us as products, as flower power shirts, Carnaby Street, as records, as accoutrements for identity. They learned that, and over time they learned they could sell us our identity. That life's purpose would be to consume, but not just to consume to get, just because you like filling your belly or whatever, or you like getting drunk, but to consume items that defined who we were. Are you somebody who wears Levi's or Wranglers? Are you somebody who drives a Ford or a Vauxhall? Are you somebody who lives in the suburbs or in a loft? Have you got long hair or short hair? And it can go right down into micro detail to the point that people can be absolutely obsessed with the nail polish, the shoes, the whole kind of thing. That is who you are. The signs, you wear the signs of who you are to perform your life in this social space. And of course, we've got social media feeding this in a very sad state of affairs. In a fairly toxic way. But of course, somebody's selling this shit is making money hand over fist. A lot of these items are manufactured in third world countries by kids earning a penny a week. And very often they're not very well made, etc., etc. And you pay hundreds of pounds for a dress, and then you wear it once, So there is a whole kind of issue around that, and that is something that has been sold to the population. This was capitalism's masterstroke, and it said instead of insisting everybody have the same identity structure, in other words, occupies the same cultural space, believes the same shit, we'll make it so that it's their job to define who they are in that sense, their identity structure within the culture,
through what they buy,
and we'll make shitloads of money doing.
Oh God!
So that was the masterstroke of the 60s, and that was George Mill. He had this wonderful phrase. I think it was the title of his book. Revolt into Style. Started out as a revolt against the pleasureless, grey, post-war American and Britain, the really, really stiff 1950s. And the rock and roll comes along, which is like black music about sex, which introduced all sorts of frisson into society with Elvis the Pelvis, and all the rest of it. They quickly turned that into a money-making scheme. That was the first. That was the kind of prototype, and then and then flower power, and all the rest of it, and now we've got the outcome of that moment, So. That's all about culture, isn't it? That's all culture, but it can be. They discovered it can be fragmented, but now, because they're playing it for divide and rule as well, which is what identity politics is really. It's a game of divide and rule. I mean, very often there's something under it. It is correct to fight against racism, of course it is, and against discrimination on the basis of gender or whatever. People should, within reason, if it's not hurting other people, be able to do what the fucking hell they like, That was, let's hang on to that thing without being duped into becoming just kind of self-identity constructing consumers. Let's hang on to that freedom, because that was a good, they managed to steal it, but let's take that back, It is important, but at the same time, it can form a very, very useful distraction for the powers that be. That's what culture war is,
This is unfortunately something the Tories are very good at, as we've mentioned many times before.
Ultimately, to my mind, we need to get sort of fairly crudely Marxist about this and say, let's think about each class. And I can't say culture is a side of struggle. Well, what struggle? Well, there is a struggle for rights, and it's important, and you do it. You don't abandon it, but you don't let that be turned into a divide and rule of a war of all against all, which lets the oligarchs carry on with their fucking nefarious project of concentrating more and more wealth and power into the hands of the 1% of the 1%. Which, of course, is what is going on. That's, the whole culture, I would say, is serving the 1% of the 1% in their trickle up project.
Yeah.
Because the news media are pretty well owned by the same class, and this is class struggle. But that's got nothing to do with cloth caps and whippets or the Welsh language, or gay rights. It's to do with the place you occupy in the economic structure. It's to do with whether you depend on wages, even if those wages might be quite generous, but of course in our society now they're often not generous. Or whether you depend on owning stuff or controlling stuff, whether you live off shares. And that still holds, in despite of what Yanis Varoufakis says about this, the move of our society from capitalism into a kind of a techno-feudalism. There is still this clash of economic interests. Remember, there's a very small group of people who own the means of production, pretty well everything, and through that ownership, they have got quite a lot of power. They do delegate that power very often to wealth management corporations like BlackRock. You can find out about this by going back over our podcast, and I kind of gave a book review of, I think it's Peter Phillips' book called Giants, which is about the $17 trillion plus wealth management company. So they hand the management over to corporations, to experts who do this stuff. Generally, the top guy in one of those corporations is a billionaire himself. Larry Fink, for instance, BlackRock. The net result is an immense concentration of wealth and power, and I guess we are back to this notion of power in the hands of very, very few. And the system, the cultural system, in its official form, is a means of keeping that status quo going, of distracting us from learning what's going on, as a means of getting us to fight amongst ourselves so we don't realise our true interest and get sharpening our pitchforks and all the rest of it. This is the way in which politics is haunted by the mob.
Speaking of haunted by the mob, just a little aside, I have it from a reliable source, or I believe to be a reliable source, where I saw an interview with America's top bunker maker. And he says he has never been so busy. What are the billionaires doing with the money? They are building bunkers. Now, either they're just bored and they just want to spend some money on something, or their dreams are being haunted by the mob a lot more intensely than they were a few years ago, and they are thinking of more preparations to protect themselves from what they believe is coming. And this guy reckons that the billionaires are scared of what's coming.
Well, in that vein, I saw, I don't know, it might have been a TED or something like that. TED Talk, something on YouTube. And I might look this up actually and try and disseminate it, but it's a few years old. It might be 2 or 3 years old. And it was a talk given by a billionaire, a self-made billionaire. He's a multi-billionaire, the guy. And he was... And the gist of his talk was to talk to his fellow billionaires, but in a public space, so in a sense we could kind of eavesdrop. That was the structure of what he was doing. And he was saying, if we don't do something about where we're at, they're going to come for us. He said the pitchforks are coming, they're going to drag us out of our mansions. And he said all the excuses that we make as a class for our position, i.e. that we work very, very hard, we're very original, we earned it, we're self-made, completely nugatory. He said, I don't work that hard. He said, I work quite hard, but I don't work that hard. I'm no different from anybody else.
Yeah, especially a lot of billionaires just inherited their wealth.
Well, yeah,
anyway,
quite aside from what I call the matter of the silver spoon. Most billionaires actually got a head start, like Trump. Got an absolute head start by inheriting or being gifted before the parents die huge amounts of money. But in this case, the guy had made it himself. And he said, to tell you the truth, I was lucky. Right time, right place. Had a bit of an idea. Oh, you said I'm not. I would say I'm quite intelligent. I'm not super intelligent, and I work quite hard, but I don't work that hard. And especially now I've got loads of money, I don't work hard at all. You know. He says, but I know I'm telling you, fellow billionaires, they will come for us eventually. Hence, you know, you've got billionaire philanthropy, which actually I think stinks. Look into what Bill Gates is up to. And I know people get into all kinds of weird fantasies about Bill Gates, but objectively, you know, most of that stuff is complete horseshit. But objectively, I don't think he's a force for good in the world. You know, especially with his ties with agribusiness and all that kind of stuff. And that's worth looking into. And all this stuff's in the public domain. You don't need to get thinking about lizards and microchips. Just objectively, it's...
Oh, well, just speaking of lizards, again, this is a real aside, but we've just started watching something called Inside Job on Netflix, which is a cartoon series, and it seems very similar to Rick and Morty, if any of you know of that. It's quite funny, very rude, and it really takes the piss out of conspiracy theories. Anyway, so I would just recommend that because I thought it was pretty funny. So...
If you're in need of some entertainment,
if you need a laugh, which in this day and age, I think we do, just get some entertainment out of that. So I think now we should move on. We've a bit of a side. We've gone round the houses and we talked about what we feel culture is. So now, so bringing this back to the question. So how does everything that we've talked about here relate to the question of, are we going to see an economic collapse in the UK?
Well, to be frank, it's a fool who absolutely predicts at this point exactly what's going to happen. You know, I know top flight Marxist economists particularly are saying it's not looking great, but we don't know exactly what will trigger it off.
Well, I think that's perfectly reasonable because things are changing very fast every day. Yeah. I mean, even as we've begun this series, there's been really important and big things happened, which has changed what we were going to say, even just over the past couple of weeks. So, I mean, something really massive could happen tomorrow, maybe not in this country, but in another country that has a huge knock-on effect and really affects us, because generally the global problems which are happening are affecting us loads more because of bloody Brexit, of course. So there could be something really unexpected. Yeah. Like the pandemic popped up. I mean, we were kind of expecting it, but we had no idea when it was going to hit. So just random stuff.
Black swan events.
Black swan events. I mean, there could be anything. So yes, we can't predict, but what we can do is we can look at what's happening now. And
I think we can say with certainty that the three systems that we've looked at are pretty unstable. They're not in.
They are unstable.
They're not in a sort of a gentle.
I mean, we can say that for sure, can't we? What we've looked at, things look really unstable.
I mean, Noam Chomsky came up with a wonderful phrase the other day, which encapsulates what I've been talking about, and he talked about a confluence of crises. Yeah, which of course is what I've said. You know, is if one of them's going into that kind of chaotic mode, say the economy's in a chaotic mode, which it kind of is, and they keep telling us, oh, it's getting better. It's in fucking chaos. Yeah, and then the ecosphere is in chaos, and more wildfires, more population movements, more floods, more crop failures, and then culture, people are getting full of resentment and worry and insecurity in the midst of all that. And if those three chaoses actually all start working in the same direction, the whole thing shakes itself to pieces in a very, very nasty way. And you know, the point is when. It's not if exactly, and it might be more or less intense. And the question for us, which of course we're going to deal with in the next podcast, is well, what to do. But we can preempt it a little bit and just say we can kind of be ready. We can have done all this thinking and all this examining, and we can be preparing safety nets. And I don't mean necessarily being a prepper and getting a bunker. I mean community building. I mean consolidating trade unions, building again the trade union movement, the workers' movement that was smashed by Thatcher and Reagan and Tony Blair, and rebuilding that globally and making it international. And building and making our eco movements more coherent and more effective than they are at the moment. And there's a whole lot of things that can be done, but they are, in a sense, getting ready for the spark. If the spark doesn't come, if we absolutely just escape by the skin of our teeth, that work is not in vain, is what I would say. And I'll talk more fully about that next time. But it's a fool who says when. We know there's a great big pile of tinder, but where's the spark going to come,
Yeah, well, the thing is because everything is so unstable, the next Black Swan event that comes along is likely to be far more destructive, obviously, if it would have been otherwise, if we'd have had any kind of stability and security whatsoever. But now it's like it's just going to take a little, as you said, just a little breath of wind just to blow it over.
Yeah.
And tip us into God knows what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the state of culture now, it can obviously have an impact on economic collapse, whether economic collapse happens. It's not going to be a fully determining factor, but it can have some impact on it, right? Also, it will be influenced by it as more and more economic instability affects people's lives. Inflation, they don't quite have enough money to get by. That produces resentment, it produces anger. With a bit of luck, it will then produce strikes, maybe even general strikes. But if it goes bad, it'll just produce chaos and mindless violence.
Yeah.
This is why.
And I can't see the economy doing very well in chaos and mindless violence, really.
No, of course, then the economy will spiral down, creating more So this is why movements are very important. But why those movements, the focus of those movements needs to be on that economic base. Even though I don't rule out any of the other struggles. And the struggles need to be able to work together too, which is a very important thing that needs to happen. And I think that can happen. But the amount of work getting that to happen and pulling all that together is going to be extraordinary. But I don't want to preempt the next one. I still have things to say about culture, but along the lines that the culture itself will be affected, and we can look at it for science by what's happening in eco and by what's happening in the ecosphere and by what's happening in the economy.
So what's changing, what we can see changing culturally will be signs of what's going to happen economically.
Yeah, and of course the way those signs pan out, the way those movements, the way that pans out within the psyche of groups, classes, political affiliations, but also within individuals. Remember, there is a psychic aspect to all this, which is one of the other systems we wanted to talk about, world psyche. There is a psychic life of culture. Culture has a psychic life, of course it does. We internalise it. That is how it works. It's internalised in individuals, even though there is huge shared elements of that internalisation. It reaches beyond the kind of surface of our skin and the surface of our eyes, because language. We have language inside us and language is outside us in the world. We share everything through language. That's why an understanding of language is very, very important, even though it gets very esoteric in philosophy. It is actually a lot hangs by whether we manage to understand that or not.
So would you say you're seeing any cultural signs which are pointing towards economic collapse at the moment?
Yeah, I think resentment and anger is at quite a pitch over inflation, the erosion of wages over the last 40 years, to be honest with you. Seriously, nobody's had a pay rise for 20 years. though the rich have got absolutely richer and richer, and they profit from crises.
So the divide between the rich and the poor is just
Yeah.
like getting bigger everywhere.
Yeah. The seriously rich. The oligarchs have made trillions worldwide out of the pandemic.
Oh, so disgusting.
Now, if you went
Yeah.
on furlough, you didn't get your full wages. You got 80% of your wages.
Yeah.
We've earned no money for a couple of years, have we?
No.
Because of it. We were
Yeah.
just starting to get our shit together here, and then
Yeah.
no money.
And then
So-
and this coincides with the Tories putting up the national insurance.
Yeah, well, so the tax base has gone up on the very poorest.
Yeah, and at the same time, taking 20 quid a week off people
Universal
who are on
credit.
universal credit,
Yeah.
and because of the energy crisis, and also because of Brexit, all your bills are going up as well, and food bills. So the cost of living is massively rising.
Yeah,
So we talk about this thing called Tinder quite a bit, and what we mean by that is it's like piles of dry tinder lying around the country, increasingly getting bigger every day, and in danger of just one little spark straying in their directions, which will cause them to burst into flames, which then in turn could ignite all the other big piles of tinder around the country. And,
Yeah.
and we actually started to categorise them, didn't we, as the different kinds of tinder, and that's something. So the different things that different groups are particularly angry about, or
Yeah.
would be particularly set off by.
Yeah.
And when we started writing them down, and the list is quite long, isn't it? When you really start
about
thinking about all the things,
15 pages.
the horrible things which are causing this. Because it's almost like you can feel the rage in the air. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff. There's a lot of despair, and as well. But there's a lot of anger. It's like you can almost like feel it in the air in the country.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of mental health consequences of COVID, which we predicted right at the outset.
Yeah.
And there will be mental health consequences of the stark poverty that's coming about.
Yes.
We've got millions of children in poverty.
Yeah.
We've got the United Nations saying that Britain is they're not quite saying this, but they're almost saying it's a failed state on the level of the treatment of the disabled. It's actually been reprimanded by the United Nations for its treatment of the disabled, this country, and the cruelty of the DWP. I would say there's an awful lot of resentment, an awful lot of anger.
Yeah.
And remember, we do have sort of fairly full employment, but a lot of those jobs are bullshit jobs. They're precariat jobs. Uber drivers.
Yeah, almost designed to make people anxious.
Yeah, they are designed to make you anxious. But then there's a cultural move to kind of represent that as a good thing. They say, but you're your own boss, right? You have your autonomy. You can work when you feel like it. Failing to mention that you might need to work 14 hours a day to get by. You might get called out when you're having your tea, and you have to. But you don't get any holiday pay. You don't get any sickness pay. You don't get any maternity benefit because you're self-employed. And that whole scam has produced, two types of culture. There will be the culture of the people who are involved in that. And interestingly, they are starting to unionise. This is one of the bright spots. They're starting to unionise. And they do go on strike, and they do withhold the labour, and they're realising that they have power. Remember, workers have got the ultimate power, should they grasp it.
Yeah.
There's no economy without them.
Yeah.
If they all say, let's have a general strike, like they did actually, incidentally, in South Korea. There's been a huge general strike, very, very well supported, in South Korea. I don't know whether it's still going on, but it was happening last week. They've really focused their efforts, the working class in South Korea. Meanwhile, there's a military coup in the Sudan. In certain parts of the world, the shit is already hitting the fan. So yeah, on top of that, you've got I'd say like bullshit jobs, precariat. And they can say, "Oh, we've got full employment," but actually, you look at what's really happening. It's not very nice, and there is a lot of real poverty in this very, very rich country. And as we know, the 1% of the 1% have got fantastically richer over the last couple of years. In fact, since 2008, and I keep saying this, Goldman Sachs made 30 billion out of crashing the economy. They got rewarded for crashing the global economy with their fucking scamming fucking casino bullshit. So there's a lot to say about that. But you see, it's like those Uber drivers will have their own culture, and they're suddenly realising we can unionise. That is a cultural move, but of course it'll have a material and an economic effect, because they'll realise they've got some muscle, right? That's a good sign. But over and against that, because culture is a contested area, because it's a war zone, the powers that be will be telling them that this is a wonderful opportunity for you to be your own boss. They'll paint a picture of it that's very, very rosy, and propagate it out through government announcements, through speeches in the Commons, through television programmes and all the rest of it. So the signs are all there in what's happening culturally of the contestation intensifying. There's a lot of divide and rule going on. So you can get COVID idiots outside hospitals screaming at doctors to say that you ought to be tried at Nuremberg and hung. Now this is actually very advantageous to the powers that be, as long as it doesn't get out of hand. As I said, it's a very dangerous game to play, but they're playing it.
I reckon they have to. I don't think they've got any choice, actually, because if they didn't try and stop the public banding together at every single possibility, I think they would have been run out of town by now.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of far-right money finds its way into that movement, and that's now fairly well documented. Coming through from the Koch brothers, or the Koch brother, as it is now, through climate denial, which big oil has consistently done. So there's a cultural war over that, which we mentioned and went into to some extent in our last podcast about the ecosphere. They're attempting to create a culture that says that the climate change is a hoax, and they're able to cash in on something that's actually kind of sensible at the root of that, and that is the fact that ordinary people, by and large now, do not trust governments and do not trust the media. And those are actually like very realistic intimations. Governments do bad things. The media lies.
This can't be trusted as far as you can throw out.
The media tell lies all the time, but they then, the Koch brothers can feed that suspicion and divert it into anything that will divide and rule, that will stop us from forming one unified force, pursuing our own economic interest. Because if they didn't prevent it, we would be there at the gates of the mansions, and Parliament would be in flames. The houses of Parliament would be burning again, like they did in the 19th century. So that's where we're at. We can see culture as like providing us with symptoms to look at, but we can also understand that there are ways afoot in which the battle is being waged, in which culture is attempting to be an influence, one way or the other, in what the outcomes will be and what kind of future society we'll have. And that means primarily how the economy will be organised, and also very importantly and primarily, maybe even more significantly, how we will stop completely wrecking the ecosphere, without which there is no life. And this is a very dangerous pass that we're in.
Yeah, and speaking of the ecosphere, I mean, this developed like a couple of days ago, wasn't it? Where the Tories all voted to pour sewage into the rivers.
Yeah.
I mean, the wave of anger that came from the public that came out about that was pretty huge, wasn't it?
I don't like it.
Although I don't think any of the right-wing papers particularly reported on this.
No, but it gets out, doesn't it? Because it's in Parliament, it gets out.
Yeah.
People are just outing the Tory MPs that voted to reject the Lord's amendment, saying that they'd got to take responsibility, the water companies.
Yeah.
And of course, the shareholders, again, of the privatised water companies, are making fantastic dividends.
And again, shows another reason not to trust the government, because they were shouting about, we must get out of the EU because of we want to make our environmental laws better, and the EU is stopping us, which was all a big fat lie anyway, because what the EU laws was just a baseline of environmental protection laws, and we were always at liberty to increase them and make the standards higher if we wanted to anyway. So that was a lie to start with. But another lie just on top of that lie, there's all these layers of lies, aren't there? Was that the Tories said, well, we must leave the EU so that we can, because what we really want is to make our environmental standards better. And now they're pouring sewage into the rivers, so that just shows that they were totally lying about that, like we always knew that they were.
Yeah, but there's a tremendous irony here, and it is that a completely rational and realistic and fact-based apprehension of the mendacity of government and the mendacity of the media that serve government has been diverted into a means of protecting the oligarchs, who the government and the press work for, from the people and the people's pursuit of its real self-interest. That's the irony, because it actually is the sensible thing to do, is to distrust the government and to examine everything that it does. And the same with the media. That is the absolutely rational, realistic thing to do. And yet the powers that be are so fucking cunning, they're able to twist that, to their advantage. And that's kind of where we're at.
They are a slippery, slimy bunch.
But I was actually listening this morning to Yanis Varoufakis being quizzed by Slavoj Žižek, and of course that was a real treat, And he analyses the situation and the effects of the COVID and the structure of the big tech companies and all the rest of it. Pretty well giving an analysis pretty similar to ours. At the point where I got to, I haven't finished watching it yet, but the point...
It's 2 hours long, isn't it?
At the point that he got to, he was talking about how unstable everything is, and about, culturally, economically, ecologically. He's talking about all that. And arriving again at the same conclusion that we are. He says, all of this is a great gift for fascists. But I think that's the next episode, isn't it? We talk what is to be done. When we will talk about what is to be done, where is this going? And of course, it's not going anywhere except where people take it. So
and I suppose if something very major completely changes the game in the next few days, then this middle bit, part 2, which is the present, we'll have another section.
Well, it'll have a twist. I mean, there could be twists, Yeah. There could very well be twists.
I mean, things are just moving so fast.
Yeah, but I don't think it's going to change the substance of what we've said.
Oh no! I mean, what we've said here would be relevant, but I'm just saying that there could be a very important episode still to come that has not quite happened yet, or not unfolded fully enough for everyone to be aware of. Okay, so I think that's probably everything. I've just mentioned though. The reason why the sewage is going into the rivers is because of Brexit. The sunlit uplands we were always promised are actually full of shit. Literally. And this is because of the vital ingredients that we need to purify our water that come from Europe are in very short supply. So they are diverting these ingredients to purify our drinking water. Doesn't seem to be enough to do too much with the sewage. God help us if we run out of enough to purify the water for the population, and let's just hope that doesn't happen. But that was definitely on the horizon with no deal Brexit. That was one of the things I was quite worried about. I mean, that was actually in the Yellowhammer report, which was a paper that the Tories wrote themselves about the consequences of a no deal Brexit. Was these the supplies to purify our water would cease to flow into the country.
Yeah.
And of course, they haven't stockpiled the necessary ingredients. So, hurrah! Anyway, so I hope everyone found that interesting, and we will move on to our next episode in a few days. Probably we'll get it ready and steam ahead with all this interesting stuff. So I hope you're all okay, and we'll speak to you soon.
Make knowledge great again.